Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a true crime storytelling channel for sleeping. Let's go. Story 1, Charles Manson. In the summer of 1969, the word helter-skelter was found scrawled in blood on the walls of a Beverly Hills mansion, marking the beginning of one of the most infamous crime sprees in American history. But to understand the horror that would unfold across Los Angeles that August, we must first journey back to the origins of evil itself. To a small town in Ohio where a child named Charles Mills Manson was born into a world that seemed determined to destroy him from the very beginning. The story of Charles Manson is not just the tale of a killer, but the chronicle of how society's failures can create monsters, and how those monsters can then turn that same society's dreams into nightmares. November 12, 1934. In Cincinnati, Ohio, 16-year-old Kathleen Maddox gave birth to a son she never wanted. The father was unknown. Maddox had been with several men during the time of conception, including a man named William Manson, who would eventually give the boy his surname, though he would disappear from their lives before the child could walk. Kathleen Maddox was everything a mother shouldn't be. She was an alcoholic, a petty criminal, and utterly indifferent to the needs of her infant son. When Charles was barely old enough to walk, Maddox would leave him alone for days while she went on drinking binges or pursued relationships with men who wanted nothing to do with a woman encumbered by a child. The few memories Manson would retain from his earliest years were of hunger, neglect, and abandonment. He learned to fend for himself before he learned to speak properly, scavenging for food in garbage cans and sleeping wherever he could find shelter when his mother failed to come home. By the time Charles was 5, Maddox had been arrested multiple times for theft, assault, and public intoxication. The boy was shuffled between relatives who didn't want him, foster homes that couldn't handle him, and brief periods with his increasingly unstable mother. Each placement failed, each relationship ended in rejection, and each experience taught young Charles that the world was fundamentally hostile to his existence. The turning point came when Charles was 9 years old. Maddox had been sentenced to prison for armed robbery, and there was no one left willing to take the boy. He was declared a ward of the state and sent to the Gibeau School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana, a Catholic institution that promised to reform wayward children through discipline, education, and religious instruction. But the Gibeau School was no sanctuary. It was a harsh, authoritarian environment where vulnerable boys were subjected to physical and psychological abuse by both staff and older inmates. Charles, small for his age and already marked by years of neglect, became a target for every form of cruelty the institution could devise. It was at Gibeau that Charles Manson learned the fundamental lesson that would shape the rest of his life, that the world was divided into predators and prey, and that survival meant becoming a predator himself. Charles escaped from Gibeau after 10 months, beginning a pattern of flight and recapture that would define his adolescence. He was sent to increasingly harsh institutions: the Indiana Boys School, the Federal Training School for Boys, the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C. Each placement was supposed to be his chance for rehabilitation, but each became another chapter in his education in violence and manipulation. At these institutions, Charles discovered he possessed certain talents that would serve him well in the predatory world of juvenile detention. He was intelligent, articulate when he chose to be, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people's weaknesses and desires. More importantly, he learned to use charm and psychological manipulation as weapons more effective than physical violence. By the time he was released at age 19, Charles Manson had spent more of his life in institutions than in the outside world. He had no family, no friends, no legitimate job skills, and no understanding of how normal people lived and related to each other. What he did have was a profound hatred for society and an arsenal of manipulative techniques learned from years of surviving in the most brutal environments imaginable. His first taste of freedom lasted exactly 6 months. Manson was arrested for car theft in 1955 and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. It was during this incarceration that he began to develop the philosophical framework that would later justify his crimes. He studied psychology, sociology, and religion, not out of genuine interest in learning, but as tools to better understand and manipulate human behavior. Prison also introduced Manson to the teachings of Dale Carnegie, whose book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, became his Bible. But where Carnegie intended his techniques to build genuine relationships, Manson perverted them into methods of psychological control and exploitation. When Manson was released from prison in 1967, he emerged into a world that seemed designed specifically for someone with his talents. The summer of love was dawning in San Francisco, and thousands of young people were flocking to the Haight-Ashbury district, seeking spiritual enlightenment, communal living, and freedom from the constraints of conventional society. These seekers, mostly middle-class kids rebelling against their parents' values, were perfect targets for Manson's predatory instincts. They were naive, idealistic, and desperately searching for meaning and belonging. They were also estranged from their families, making them less likely to be missed if they disappeared into the counterculture underground. Manson established himself in the Haight as a guru figure, attracting followers with a mixture of half-digested philosophy, musical talent, and an uncanny ability to sense exactly what each person needed to hear. He preached love, peace, and spiritual awakening, but underneath the hippie rhetoric was a core message of hatred and apocalyptic violence. His first devoted follower was Lynette Squeaky Fromm, a troubled young woman from a middle-class family who had run away to San Francisco, seeking adventure and meaning. Fromme was intelligent, articulate, and completely vulnerable to Manson's manipulation. Within weeks of meeting him, she had surrendered her will entirely to his control. Fromme was followed by Susan Atkins, a former church-going girl whose parents had died when she was young, leaving her adrift and searching for a family to replace the one she had lost. Then came Patricia Krenwinkel, the overweight, insecure daughter of an insurance salesman who had never felt loved or accepted until Manson convinced her she was special. One by one, Manson collected his followers, mostly young women who had been damaged by trauma, abuse, or simple neglect, and who were desperate for someone to tell them they mattered. He gave them new names, new identities, and a new purpose that revolved entirely around serving his needs and desires. By 1968, Manson's group had grown to nearly 30 members and had relocated to the remote Spahn Ranch in the hills outside Los Angeles. The ranch, once used for filming Western movies, had fallen into decay and was now owned by an elderly, nearly blind man named George Spahn, who allowed the group to stay in exchange for the sexual services of the younger women. At Spahn Ranch, Manson's control over his followers became absolute. He implemented a system of psychological conditioning that broke down their individual identities and rebuilt them as extensions of his will. Members were forbidden to use their given names, to maintain contact with their families, or to question any of Manson's decisions or teachings. The daily routine at the ranch was designed to reinforce Manson's authority and prevent his followers from developing independent thoughts or relationships. Days began with group meditation sessions where Manson would deliver rambling sermons, mixing elements of Christianity, Scientology, and his own twisted philosophy. Members were kept constantly busy with chores, scavenging missions, and sexual activities orchestrated by Manson to break down normal boundaries and attachments. Most insidiously, Manson used drugs as a tool of control. He would dose his followers with LSD and other hallucinogens, then guide their experiences to reinforce his teachings and increase their dependence on him. Under the influence of these drugs, members experienced visions and revelations that seemed to confirm Manson's status as a prophet and their own roles as his chosen disciples. During this period, Manson's philosophy began to coalesce into a coherent, if completely insane, worldview. He preached that a race war was coming, a final battle between blacks and whites that would destroy civilization and leave him and his followers as the only survivors. He called this coming apocalypse Helter Skelter, borrowing the term from a Beatles song that he claimed contained hidden messages meant specifically for him. According to Manson's prophecy, the family would survive the race war by hiding in a bottomless pit in Death Valley, emerging after the chaos to rule over the post-apocalyptic world. But first, they would need to help trigger the war by committing murders that would be blamed on the Black Panthers and other militant groups. As 1969 progressed, Manson's rhetoric became increasingly violent, and his control over his followers increasingly complete. He began selecting certain members for special training in what he called creepy crawling, breaking into homes while the occupants slept, moving objects around, and leaving without taking anything or harming anyone. These practice sessions were supposedly preparation for the coming war, but they also served to desensitize his followers to invasion of privacy and violation of normal social boundaries. Manson also began incorporating weapons training into the daily routine at Spawn Ranch. Members practiced with knives, learning techniques for silent killing and efficient disposal of bodies. They studied maps of Los Angeles, identifying wealthy neighborhoods where their future victims would live. Throughout this period, Manson continued to attract new followers, including several who would play crucial roles in the murders to come. Charles Tex Watson joined the group in 1968, bringing with him a college education and a past that included drug dealing and robbery. Unlike the damaged young women who made up most of the family, Watson was calculating and ambitious, seeing in Manson an opportunity to gain power and status. Leslie Van Houten arrived at Spawn Ranch in 1968 as well, a middle-class teenager whose descent into the family began with experimentation with drugs and rebellion against her conservative parents. Von Houten was intelligent and articulate, but also deeply troubled by guilt over an abortion she had undergone as a teenager. Guilt that Manson expertly exploited to gain control over her. Perhaps most significantly, Linda Kasabian joined the family in July 1969, just weeks before the murders began. Kasabian was different from the other members in that she maintained some connection to the outside world and some capacity for independent moral judgment. This difference would ultimately prove crucial to bringing Manson and his followers to justice. August 9, 1969. The address was 10050 Cielo Drive, Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles, a secluded estate in the hills above the city where the rich and famous sought privacy and security. The house was currently rented by Roman Polanski, the acclaimed film director, and his wife Sharon Tate, the rising starlet who was 8 months pregnant with their first child. That night, Polanski was in London working on a film, leaving Tate at home with 3 friends: Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairstylist and Tate's former lover; Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune; and Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish screenwriter and Folger's boyfriend. Also present was Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old who had been visiting the property's caretaker and was preparing to leave when the killers arrived. Around 10 p.m., a car carrying Charles Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian pulled up outside the gates of 10050 Cielo Drive. Watson climbed the telephone pole and cut the phone lines, ensuring that no one inside could call for help. Then the 4 intruders scaled the fence and approached the house, armed with knives, rope, and a .22 caliber revolver. Stephen Perron was their first victim. As he drove toward the gate in his white Rambler, Watson approached the car and shot him 4 times through the window. Parent died instantly, slumping over the steering wheel as his car rolled to a stop against the fence. Inside the house, the 4 friends were unaware that death had already arrived at their doorstep. They were spending a quiet evening together, Tate and Folger talking about the upcoming baby, Sebring working on scripts, Frykowski dozing on the couch. The first indication that something was wrong came when Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel burst through the front door, Watson waving his gun and shouting for everyone to lie down on the floor. What followed was a scene of unimaginable brutality and terror. Watson herded the 4 victims into the living room, binding their hands and necks with rope while demanding money and threatening to kill anyone who tried to escape. When it became clear that robbery was not the true motive, the victims began to realize they were going to die. Jay Sebring was the first to be murdered inside the house. When he tried to protect Sharon Tate, Watson shot him in the chest and then stabbed him multiple times. As Sebring lay dying, Watson turned his attention to the others, systematically torturing and killing each victim, while Atkins and Krenwinkel assisted. Abigail Folger attempted to escape, running from the house toward the pool area, but Krenwinkel pursued her and stabbed her repeatedly until she collapsed. Wojciech Frykowski also tried to flee, making it to the front lawn before Watson caught up with him and delivered the final fatal wounds. Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant and terrified for her unborn child, was the last to die. She begged for mercy, pleading that they spare her baby even if they had to kill her. But Watson and Atkins showed no compassion, stabbing her 16 times while she called out for her mother. Before leaving the scene, Atkins used Tate's blood to write "pig" on the front door of the house, a message meant to implicate the Black Panthers and help trigger the race war that Manson had prophesied. The murders at Cielo Drive should have been enough to satisfy even Manson's bloodlust, but he was dissatisfied with his followers' performance. He criticized them for being too frenzied, too emotional, and insufficiently methodical. The next night, August 10th, 1969, he decided to show them how murder should be done. This time, Manson accompanied the killers personally, directing Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten to a house in the Los Feliz area of Los Angeles. The target was 3301 Waverly Drive, home of Leno LaBianca, a successful businessman who owned a chain of grocery stores, and his wife Rosemary, a former employee of a dress shop. The LaBiancas had no connection to the Manson family or to the victims from the previous night. They were chosen purely at random, representing the kind of comfortable middle-class life that Manson despised and sought to destroy. Unlike the chaotic frenzy at Cielo Drive, the LaBianca murders were carried out with cold, methodical precision. Manson entered the house first, surprising the couple as they slept, and binding them with rope before his followers entered to complete the killings. The murders were even more brutal than those of the previous night. The killers carved war into Leno LaBianca's abdomen and stabbed him multiple times with a bayonet and knife. Rosemary LaBianca was stabbed 41 times, her body left in their bedroom while her husband's corpse remained in the living room. Before leaving, the killers wrote additional messages in blood throughout the house. "Death to pigs" on the living room wall, "Rise" on another wall, and "Helter Skelter," misspelled, on the refrigerator door. These messages were intended to confuse investigators and deflect blame onto militant political groups. The discovery of the bodies at both crime scenes sent shockwaves through Los Angeles and the entire nation. The brutality of the killings, combined with the cryptic messages left at the scenes, created an atmosphere of terror and paranoia that gripped the city for months. Initially, police investigated the murders as separate incidents, failing to recognize the connections between them. The Cielo Drive murders were assigned to the West Los Angeles Division, while the LaBianca case went to the Los Feliz Division. This jurisdictional split would delay the investigation for crucial months. The first breakthrough came not from detective work, but from the arrest of several Manson family members on unrelated charges. In October 1969, police raided Barker Ranch in Death Valley, where Manson and many of his followers had been hiding since the murders. The raid was prompted by reports of auto theft and vandalism, not any connection to the Los Angeles killings. During the raid, Susan Atkins was arrested and eventually charged with the murder of Gary Hinman, a music teacher who had been killed by family members in July 1969. While in custody, Atkins began talking to cellmates about other crimes she had committed, eventually confessing to her role in the Tate murders. The details Atkins revealed were so horrific and bizarre that initially no one believed her. She claimed to have tasted Sharon Tate's blood, to have wanted to cut out Tate's unborn baby, and to have committed the murders on the orders of Charles Manson, whom she described as both Jesus Christ and the devil. But as detectives investigated Atkins' claims, they found that her knowledge of the crime scenes was far too detailed and accurate to have been obtained from newspaper reports. Gradually, the full scope of the Manson family's crimes began to emerge. The trial of Charles Manson and his co-defendants began in June 1970 and immediately became a media sensation. The combination of celebrity victims, bizarre motives, and the defendants' outrageous courtroom behavior created a spectacle unlike anything in American legal history. Manson used the trial as a platform to spread his apocalyptic message and demonstrate his continued control over his followers. He carved an X into his forehead, later changed to a swastika, rambled about environmental destruction and social collapse, and encouraged his co-defendants to disrupt proceedings with bizarre outbursts and theatrical gestures. The prosecution, led by Vincent Bugliosi, faced the difficult task of proving that Manson was responsible for murders he had not personally committed and locations where he had not been present. They had to establish that Manson's psychological control over his followers was so complete that he was effectively the mastermind behind every aspect of the crimes. The key witness was Linda Kasabian, who had been present at both murder scenes but had not actually participated in the killings. Kasabian had fled the family shortly after the murders and eventually agreed to testify in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Her testimony provided crucial details about the planning and execution of the crimes, as well as insight into Manson's methods of control. Kasabian's testimony revealed the full horror of what had occurred during those 2 nights in August. She described how Manson had sent his followers out to commit copycat murders that would be blamed on black militants, how he had chosen the victims randomly, and how he had shown no remorse for the deaths of innocent people, including an unborn child. Perhaps most chillingly, Kasabian testified about Manson's reaction when his followers returned from the Cielo Drive murders. Rather than showing any concern for what they had done, he had criticized them for being too messy and emotional, and had promised to show them how to kill more efficiently the following night. On January 25, 1971, after one of the longest and most expensive trials in California history, Charles Manson and 3 of his followers, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, were found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Charles Watson was tried separately and also convicted. All 5 defendants were sentenced to death, but their sentences were commuted to life imprisonment when California temporarily abolished the death penalty in 1972. Manson and his followers have remained in prison ever since, with their periodic parole hearings becoming media events that reliably generate headlines and public outrage. The Manson murders marked the end of the 1960s counterculture movement and the beginning of a more cynical, fearful era in American society. The idea that young people seeking peace and love could be transformed into instruments of senseless violence shattered many of the decade's most cherished illusions about human nature and social progress. The case also established new precedents in criminal law regarding the prosecution of criminal conspiracies and the legal responsibility of cult leaders for crimes committed by their followers. The concept of helter-skelter prosecution, proving that a defendant orchestrated crimes without directly participating in them, became a standard tool for law enforcement agencies dealing with organized criminal enterprises. In the decades since the murders, psychologists, criminologists, and social scientists have studied the Manson case intensively, seeking to understand how seemingly ordinary young people could be transformed into killers. The case has become a textbook example of how charismatic leaders can exploit psychological vulnerabilities to gain absolute control over their followers. Several factors combined to make Manson's followers susceptible to his influence. Most were young people who had experienced trauma, abuse, or severe family dysfunction. They were seeking meaning, belonging, and unconditional acceptance, needs that Manson promised to fulfill while actually exploiting them for his own purposes. Manson's methods of control were sophisticated and systematic. He used a combination of love bombing, overwhelming new recruits with attention and affection, isolation from outside influences, sleep and nutritional deprivation, constant indoctrination, sexual manipulation, and carefully administered drugs to break down his followers' individual identities and rebuild them according to his specifications. The process was gradual and incremental. New members were not immediately asked to commit murder, but were instead drawn into increasingly serious criminal activities through a series of small compromises in boundary violations. By the time they were asked to kill, they had already surrendered so much of their moral autonomy that resistance seemed impossible. The case also highlighted the dangers of apocalyptic ideologies and the way they can be used to justify any action, no matter how heinous. By convincing his followers that they were living in the final days before a race war that would destroy civilization, Manson made their crimes seem not just acceptable, but necessary for the survival of humanity. More than 50 years after the murders, the name Charles Manson continues to evoke fear, fascination, and revulsion in equal measure. He has become a symbol of pure evil in American culture, referenced in countless books, films, documentaries, and academic studies. The Manson case fundamentally changed how Americans think about personal safety, community trust, and the potential for violence in seemingly peaceful settings. The fact that the murders occurred in wealthy, supposedly secure neighborhoods demonstrated that no one was truly safe from random violence. The case also contributed to the end of the hippie movement and the broader counterculture of the 1960s. The image of young people with long hair and unconventional lifestyles became associated in many minds with violence and moral corruption, leading to a backlash that would influence American politics and culture for decades. Law enforcement agencies learned important lessons about the investigation of cult-related crimes and the prosecution of conspiracy cases. The techniques developed by Vincent Bugliosi and his team became standard practice for dealing with cases involving charismatic leaders and their followers. Perhaps most importantly, the Manson case serves as a permanent warning about the potential for evil that exists within human nature and society. It demonstrates how quickly civilization can break down when individuals surrender their moral autonomy to authoritarian leaders who promise simple answers to complex problems. Charles Manson died in prison on November 19, 2017, at the age of 83, having spent more than 45 years behind bars. Until the end, he remained unrepentant for his crimes, continuing to deny direct responsibility for the murders, while simultaneously taking credit for their cultural impact. In interviews over the decades, Manson revealed himself to be intelligent, articulate, and completely without conscience. He showed no empathy for his victims, no remorse for the suffering he had caused, and no understanding of why society considered his actions wrong. He remained convinced that he was a visionary who had simply been ahead of his time in recognizing the violent nature of human society. The surviving members of the Manson family have had varied fates. Some, like Lynette Fromme and Sandra Good, remain loyal to Manson until his death and beyond. Others, like Leslie Van Houten, have expressed remorse for their crimes and attempted to rebuild their lives in prison. Susan Atkins died of brain cancer in 2009, while Patricia Krenwinkel and Charles Watson remain incarcerated. The case continues to generate new books, documentaries, and academic studies, each attempting to understand how such evil could emerge from the supposed peace and love of the 1960s counterculture. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Manson murders is not about the specific circumstances that created one monster, but about the eternal vigilance required to prevent the creation of new ones. The story of Charles Manson and his family is ultimately a story about the fragility of civilization and the ease with which it can be destroyed by those who understand human weakness and exploit it without conscience. It reminds us that evil is not some external force that invades society from outside, but a potential that exists within all human communities and can be activated under the right circumstances. The young people who followed Manson were not inherently evil. They were damaged, vulnerable individuals seeking healing and belonging in a world that had failed to provide them with the love and security they needed. Their tragedy is that they encountered a manipulator who used their pain against them, transforming their search for meaning into an instrument of senseless destruction. The victims of the Manson murders, Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, Stephen Parent, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, and the unborn child who died with Sharon Tate, remain the true focus of this story. They were innocent people whose lives were cut short by violence they had done nothing to provoke or deserve. Their deaths serve as a permanent reminder that evil exists in the world, that it can strike without warning or reason, and that the only defense against it is the maintenance of moral communities that provide love, support, and meaning to all their members, especially those who are most vulnerable to exploitation by predators like Charles Manson. In the end, the story of Charles Manson is not just a tale of true crime, but a mirror held up to American society, reflecting both its highest aspirations and its deepest failures. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature while working to create a world where such monsters cannot find the broken souls they need to carry out their visions of destruction. Story 2, The Coast to Coast Killer. The interstate highway system, completed in the 1970s, was hailed as one of America's greatest achievements, a network of roads that would unite the nation and bring prosperity to every corner of the country. But for one man, these highways became something far more sinister, a hunting ground that stretched from coast to coast, enabling a killing spree that would terrorize the nation for over a decade. Tommy Lynn Sells called himself a drifter, a wanderer who rode the rails and hitchhiked the highways of America. But law enforcement would come to know him by a different name, the Coast to Coast Killer, a predator whose crimes spanned multiple states and decades, leaving a trail of death that investigators are still trying to fully comprehend. The story of Tommy Lynn Sells is not just the chronicle of a serial killer, but a dark mirror reflecting America's hidden underworld, a shadow society of forgotten people living on the margins, where violence can flourish unseen and victims can disappear without a trace. Tommy Lynn Sells was born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California. But his childhood was spent in motion, a constant parade of foster homes, relatives' houses, and temporary shelters that would shape his understanding of the world as a place without permanence or safety. His mother, Nina Sells, was barely 18 when Tommy was born, already struggling with alcoholism and an inability to care for herself, let alone a child. His father was absent from the beginning, leaving Nina to raise Tommy and his twin sister Tammy alone. But Nina was fundamentally unsuited for motherhood, and within months of the twins' birth, she had abandoned them to the care of relatives. Tommy's earliest memories were of confusion and rejection. He was shuffled between his grandmother, various aunts and uncles, and eventually into the foster care system when his family could no longer cope with his increasingly difficult behavior. Each placement was temporary. Each relationship ended in disappointment, and each rejection reinforced Tommy's growing belief that he was fundamentally unwanted and unloved. The abuse began early and came from multiple sources. Foster fathers who saw him as a convenient target for their rage, older children in group homes who used him for sexual gratification, and authority figures who seemed to take pleasure in his suffering. By the age of 7, Tommy had been sexually assaulted multiple times, beaten regularly, and exposed to levels of violence and cruelty that would have broken most children completely. But Tommy didn't break. He adapted. He learned to lie convincingly, to steal what he needed, and to disappear when danger approached. Most importantly, he learned that other people's pain could be a source of power and control, emotions that had been completely absent from his own life. His first serious crime occurred when he was just 8 years old. Tommy had been placed with a foster family in Missouri when he encountered a neighbor boy who had been taunting him about his status as a throwaway kid. In a moment of rage, Tommy picked up a baseball bat and struck the boy in the head, fracturing his skull and nearly killing him. The incident should have been a warning sign, a clear indication that Tommy was developing dangerous tendencies that required immediate intervention. Instead, he was simply moved to another placement, then another, and another. The system that was supposed to protect and rehabilitate him had instead taught him that violence was an acceptable response to frustration and that there would always be new opportunities to hurt others. By the time Tommy turned 13, he had given up on the possibility of finding a stable home or family. Instead, he began living on the streets, supporting himself through petty crime and developing the skills that would later make him one of America's most elusive killers. The streets were a brutal classroom, but Tommy proved to be an excellent student. He learned to read people quickly, identifying potential victims and threats with remarkable accuracy. He discovered that his small size and youthful appearance could be advantages, making adults underestimate him and lowering their guard. Most importantly, he began to understand the geography of American crime, which places were safe for predators, which victims were most vulnerable, and how to disappear when law enforcement got too close. Tommy's first confirmed kill occurred in 1979 when he was just 15 years old. He had been traveling through Texas when he encountered a middle-aged man at a truck stop who offered him money for sex. Tommy agreed, but once they were alone, he turned on the man with a knife, stabbing him repeatedly in what he would later describe as a moment of pure rage and pleasure combined. The murder was never officially connected to Tommy. The victim was found days later in a remote area, and police assumed he had been killed during a robbery gone wrong. This early success taught Tommy several crucial lessons. That murder could be incredibly satisfying on an emotional level, that careful victim selection could minimize the risk of detection, and that America's highways provided perfect cover for a mobile killer. Over the next few years, Tommy began to develop what would become his signature methodology. He would hitchhike or hop freight trains to travel between cities, always staying in motion to avoid establishing patterns that might attract police attention. He targeted victims who were themselves on society's margins, prostitutes, runaways, drifters, and other people whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. His crimes during this period were opportunistic rather than planned. Tommy would encounter potential victims during his travels and kill them if the circumstances seemed favorable. Sometimes the motive was robbery, sometimes sexual gratification, and sometimes simple bloodlust. The randomness of his victim selection and the vast geographic area he covered made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to recognize his crimes as the work of a single killer. By the mid-1980s, Tommy Lynn Sells had evolved into a sophisticated predator whose hunting ground encompassed virtually the entire United States. He had developed an intimate knowledge of America's transportation infrastructure, understanding how to use buses, trains, and hitchhiking to move quickly and anonymously between potential hunting grounds. Tommy's preferred victims during this period were women and children, particularly those who were alone and vulnerable. He would often target truck stops, bus stations, and other transportation hubs where he could identify potential victims who were traveling alone or appeared to be runaways. His youthful appearance and practiced charm allowed him to approach victims without immediately raising suspicions. One of his most brutal crimes during this period occurred in 1987 near Little Rock, Arkansas. Tommy had been hitchhiking when he was picked up by a young mother traveling with her 4-year-old daughter. The woman, whose name was never released to protect her family's privacy, had made the fatal mistake of trusting a stranger who seemed harmless and polite. Tommy directed the woman to a remote area under the pretense of needing to relieve himself. Once they were alone, he attacked both mother and child with a knife he had stolen from a truck stop restaurant. The murders were particularly savage, involving sexual assault and torture that demonstrated Tommy's evolving sadism and complete lack of empathy. The bodies were discovered 3 days later by hunters, but by then Tommy had already traveled several hundred miles and was beginning to plan his next attack. The murders were investigated as an isolated incident, with police assuming the killer was a local perpetrator who had fled the area after the crime. This pattern would repeat itself dozens of times over the following years. Tommy would arrive in a new area, identify vulnerable victims, commit brutal murders, and then disappear before law enforcement could mount an effective investigation. His constant mobility and the jurisdictional boundaries between different police departments made it nearly impossible for investigators to recognize the connections between his crimes. As the 1990s began, Tommy Lynn Sells' crimes became increasingly brutal and sadistic. What had begun as opportunistic killings driven by immediate needs had evolved into something far more disturbing. A systematic campaign of violence that seemed to be motivated primarily by the pleasure he derived from causing suffering. Tommy began to take more risks during this period, sometimes breaking into homes to attack victims in their own beds, or abducting people from public places in broad daylight. His confidence had grown with each successful crime, and he began to see himself as invincible, protected by his mobility and the incompetence of law enforcement. One of his most shocking crimes occurred in 1992 in Illinois, where Tommy broke into the home of a family while they slept. He systematically murdered the parents and 2 teenage children, but spared the youngest child, a 6-year-old girl who reminded him of his twin sister. Tommy would later claim that this moment of mercy proved he wasn't completely evil, but investigators saw it as evidence of his complete psychological deterioration. He had reached a point where showing basic human compassion seemed to him like a remarkable act of kindness. The Illinois murders were particularly significant because they marked the first time law enforcement began to suspect they might be dealing with a serial killer who operated across state lines. The brutality of the crime, combined with the lack of apparent motive, suggested a perpetrator who killed for psychological gratification rather than material gain. FBI profilers who examined the case noted several disturbing elements that would later prove characteristic of Tommy's crimes. The killer had spent considerable time at the scene, apparently savoring the violence. The murders showed both planning and spontaneous brutality, and the perpetrator seemed to possess detailed knowledge of the family's routines and vulnerabilities. By the mid-1990s, law enforcement agencies across the country were beginning to recognize patterns in a series of seemingly unrelated murders. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program had identified several dozen cases that shared similar characteristics. Victims who were vulnerable and isolated, extreme violence that seemed motivated by sadism rather than practical concerns, and a perpetrator who appeared to travel constantly and never remained in one area long enough to establish a clear pattern. The breakthrough came in 1998 when DNA evidence from several crime scenes was finally analyzed using new technology that hadn't been available when the original crimes were committed. The results were startling. At least 12 murders across 7 states had been committed by the same person, and investigators suspected the true number might be much higher. The FBI established a task force dedicated to tracking what they now knew was a serial killer of extraordinary mobility and cunning. They began mapping the killer's apparent routes, looking for connections between crime locations and transportation networks. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of a predator who used America's highway system as his personal hunting ground. The task force also began developing a psychological profile of the killer. They determined he was likely a white male between 25 and 40 years old, with extensive experience living on the margins of society. He was probably intelligent and manipulative, able to gain victims' trust quickly. Most importantly, he was almost certainly someone who had been in and out of the criminal justice system for years, possibly since childhood. This profile would prove remarkably accurate, but it still didn't provide investigators with the specific information they needed to identify and locate their suspect. Tommy Lynn Sells remained a ghost, leaving behind only bodies and DNA evidence as proof of his existence. Tommy's downfall began on December 31st, 1999, in Del Rio, Texas, where he had been staying in a trailer park and working odd jobs while planning his next move. He had been drinking heavily and using drugs, which had begun to affect his judgment and make him increasingly reckless. That New Year's Eve, Tommy broke into the home of the Harris family, intending to commit what he assumed would be another perfect crime. The family consisted of Terry Harris, his girlfriend Carmen Felix, and Felix's 3 children, 13-year-old Katie, 10-year-old Crystal, and 6-year-old Marquez. Tommy's plan was to kill the entire family and then disappear before their bodies were discovered. He had done this many times before, and his confidence in his abilities was absolute. But this time, something went wrong. Something that would ultimately lead to his capture and the end of his killing spree. Tommy entered the house through an unlocked window and immediately attacked Carmen Felix in her bedroom, stabbing her multiple times. He then moved to the children's rooms, killing young Marquez and attacking Katie Harris with a knife. But Katie was stronger and more alert than Tommy had anticipated, and she managed to fight back long enough to wake her younger sister Crystal. In the confusion that followed, Crystal managed to escape through a window and run to a neighbor's house where she called 911. When police arrived at the scene, they found 3 bodies and Katie Harris barely alive, having survived multiple stab wounds through sheer determination and luck. For the first time in his criminal career, Tommy Lynn Sells had left behind a living witness who could provide a detailed description of his appearance and methods. Katie Harris had seen his face clearly in the moonlight streaming through her bedroom window, and her description would prove crucial to his eventual capture. The attack on the Harris family marked the beginning of the end for Tommy Lynn Sells. For the first time in over 20 years of killing, he had made a critical error that would allow law enforcement to identify and track him down. Katie Harris's description of her attacker was remarkably detailed and accurate. She described a thin white man in his 30s with stringy blonde hair and distinctive tattoos. More importantly, she had noticed that he walked with a slight limp, the result of an old injury that Tommy had sustained years earlier while jumping from a moving freight train. Police immediately began canvassing the Del Rio area, looking for anyone who matched Katie's description. They quickly identified Tommy as a possible suspect. He had been living in the trailer park near the Harris home. He matched the physical description perfectly, and several neighbors reported seeing him acting strangely in the days leading up to the attack. When police arrived at Tommy's trailer, they found it abandoned but full of evidence linking him to the crime. Blood evidence, personal items belonging to the victims, and most damning of all, detailed journals in which Tommy had recorded his crimes going back more than a decade. The journals were a prosecutor's dream and a psychologist's nightmare. In meticulous detail, Tommy had recorded not just the facts of his crimes, but his emotional responses to them. He wrote about the pleasure he derived from causing pain, his complete lack of empathy for his victims, and his pride in his ability to evade capture for so long. Reading through the journals, investigators realized they had captured not just a killer, but possibly one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The entries described crimes in dozens of states, involving victims ranging from young children to elderly adults, and spanning a period of more than 20 years. Tommy Lynn Sells was arrested on January 2, 2000, at a truck stop outside San Antonio, Texas. He was attempting to hitchhike to Mexico when a highway patrol officer recognized him from the description that had been broadcast to law enforcement agencies throughout the region. When confronted with the evidence against him, Tommy initially attempted to deny his involvement in the Harris family murders. But when investigators showed him excerpts from his own journals, his facade crumbled completely. Not only did he confess to the Del Rio attack, but he began providing details about dozens of other crimes he had committed over the years. The confessions that followed would shock even experienced homicide investigators. Tommy claimed responsibility for more than 70 murders across the United States, describing his crimes with a level of detail that made it clear he was telling the truth. He seemed almost relieved to finally be able to talk about his life's work, displaying a pride in his accomplishments that was both chilling and deeply disturbing. Tommy's trial for the Harris family murders began in September 2000. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of his guilt, including DNA evidence, eyewitness testimony from Katie Harris, and Tommy's own detailed confessions. The defense attempted to argue that Tommy was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions, but the methodical nature of his crimes and his clear understanding of right and wrong made this argument difficult to sustain. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Tommy was sentenced to death for the murder of Kayleen Harris, making him one of the youngest people on Texas's death row at the time. Tommy Lynn Sells was executed by lethal injection on April 3, 2014, at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 49 years old and had spent nearly 14 years on death row, during which time he continued to confess to additional murders and provide information to law enforcement agencies investigating cold cases. In his final statement, Tommy showed no remorse for his crimes. Instead, he used his last moments to taunt the families of his victims, claiming that he had enjoyed killing their loved ones and expressing regret only that he hadn't been able to kill more people before being caught. Tommy's execution marked the end of one of the most extensive killing sprees in American criminal history. While the exact number of his victims may never be known, law enforcement agencies have confirmed his involvement in at least 22 murders, with strong evidence linking him to dozens more. The investigation into Tommy's crimes continued even after his death, as cold case detectives across the country worked to match his confessions and travel patterns with unsolved murders in their jurisdictions. This process has led to the resolution of several long-standing cases and provided closure to families who had waited decades for answers about their loved ones' deaths. The case of Tommy Lynn Sells exposed serious flaws in America's criminal justice and social services systems that allowed a dangerous predator to operate undetected for more than 2 decades. From his earliest childhood, the signs of Tommy's dangerous potential were clearly visible. But the systems designed to protect society and help troubled children failed repeatedly. Tommy's journey through the foster care system was marked by abuse, neglect, and a complete lack of therapeutic intervention, despite clear evidence of serious psychological problems. Social workers, teachers, and other authority figures who encountered him during his childhood noted his violent tendencies and manipulative behavior. But no effective action was taken to address these issues. The fragmented nature of American law enforcement also contributed to Tommy's success as a serial killer. His crimes spanned multiple states and jurisdictions, but there was no effective mechanism for sharing information and coordinating investigations across these boundaries. As a result, patterns that might have been obvious to a single investigator were invisible to the dozens of separate agencies that encountered pieces of Tommy's criminal activity. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of America's most marginalized populations. Many of Tommy's victims were people who lived on the edges of society: runaways, prostitutes, drifters, and others whose disappearances were not immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. This created a perfect hunting ground for a predator who understood that some victims are considered more important than others. Mental health professionals who studied Tommy Lynn Sells identified him as a textbook example of antisocial personality disorder combined with psychopathic traits that made him extraordinarily dangerous. His complete lack of empathy, his ability to manipulate others without feeling guilt, and his capacity to derive pleasure from causing suffering placed him among the most dangerous individuals ever studied by criminal psychologists. Tommy's childhood experiences certainly contributed to his development as a killer, but experts noted that many people experience similar trauma without becoming violent criminals. What made Tommy different was his apparent inability to form meaningful emotional connections with other people, combined with an intelligence and cunning that allowed him to exploit others' vulnerabilities. Throughout his adult life, Tommy displayed a remarkable ability to present himself as harmless and trustworthy when it served his purposes, while internally viewing other people as nothing more than objects to be used for his gratification. This capacity for deception, combined with his nomadic lifestyle, made him nearly impossible to detect until he finally made the mistake that led to his capture. Dr. Park Dietz, a prominent forensic psychiatrist who examined Tommy, noted that his case demonstrated the importance of early intervention with severely disturbed children. He argued that with proper treatment, it might have been possible to prevent Tommy from developing into a serial killer, but that by the time he committed his first murder as a teenager, he was probably beyond rehabilitation. The crimes of Tommy Lynn Sells had far-reaching impacts that extended well beyond his immediate victims. His case led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies share information about serial crimes, contributing to the development of more sophisticated databases and communication systems that help investigators identify patterns across jurisdictional boundaries. The case also influenced public policy regarding the treatment of severely disturbed children in the foster care system. Tommy's childhood experiences highlighted the need for better screening of foster families, more intensive therapeutic interventions for troubled children, and improved coordination between social services agencies and mental health professionals. For the families of Tommy's victims, his capture and execution provided some measure of closure, but also raised painful questions about whether their loved ones' deaths could have been prevented. Many victims' families became advocates for criminal justice reform and improved support services for marginalized populations who are most vulnerable to predators. The community of Del Rio, Texas, where Tommy's killing spree finally ended, struggled to come to terms with the knowledge that such evil had lived among them undetected. The attack on the Harris family shattered the community's sense of safety and innocence, leading to increased security measures and a heightened awareness of the potential for violence in even the most peaceful settings. The story of Tommy Lynn Sells serves as a stark reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within human nature and the importance of the systems we create to protect society from dangerous individuals. His case demonstrates how childhood trauma, systemic failures, and individual pathology can combine to create monsters who cause immeasurable suffering. Perhaps most importantly, Tommy's crimes highlight the vulnerability of society's most marginalized members and the need for systems that protect all people, not just those with social status and economic resources. Many of his victims were people who had been failed by society in various ways: runaways fleeing abusive homes, individuals struggling with addiction or mental illness, and others who found themselves alone and vulnerable. The case also demonstrates the crucial importance of effective communication and coordination between law enforcement agencies. Tommy was able to operate for so long partly because his crimes were investigated by dozens of different agencies that had no effective way to share information and recognize patterns. Finally, the story of Tommy Lynn Sells reminds us that evil often hides behind a mask of normalcy and that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear least threatening. Tommy's ability to present himself as harmless and trustworthy allowed him to gain access to victims who might otherwise have been more cautious. Today, America's highways continue to carry millions of travelers, most of whom reach their destinations safely and without incident. But the case of Tommy Lynn Sells serves as a permanent reminder that these same roads that connect our communities and enable our prosperity can also provide cover for those who would do us harm. The investigation into Tommy's crimes officially ended with his execution, but the impact of his actions continues to reverberate through the lives of survivors, the families of victims, and the communities he terrorized. His case has become a cornerstone of criminal justice education, studied by law enforcement professionals, mental health experts, and social scientists seeking to understand and prevent similar tragedies. The systems that failed to stop Tommy Lynn Sells have been reformed and improved, but the fundamental challenges they address remain. There are still troubled children who need help, marginalized individuals who are vulnerable to predators, and criminals who seek to exploit the gaps and weaknesses in our social fabric. The coast-to-coast killer is gone, but the highways remain, carrying new generations of travelers toward their destinations. Most will arrive safely, protected by the systems we have built and the lessons we have learned. But vigilance remains necessary because somewhere out there, another predator may be studying the same roads, looking for the same opportunities, and planning the same kinds of horrors that Tommy Lynn Sells inflicted upon innocent people for more than 20 years. The story of Tommy Lynn Sells is ultimately a story about the price of freedom, the vulnerability of trust, and the eternal struggle between those who would protect society and those who would prey upon it. It reminds us that the cost of safety is constant vigilance, and that the most important battles for human decency are often fought not in grand public arenas, but in the small, private moments when individuals choose between helping others and harming them. In those moments, the legacy of Tommy Lynn Sells serves as both a warning and a challenge to remain alert to the potential for evil, to protect the vulnerable, and to never forget that the difference between civilization and chaos often depends on the choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Story 2. Gary Heidnick's House of Horrors. In the basement of 3520 North Marshall Street in Philadelphia, beneath the floorboards of what appeared to be an ordinary row house, lay a chamber of horrors that would shock even the most hardened criminal investigators. For months in 1986 and 1987, this basement served as a prison where women were chained, tortured, and subjected to unspeakable acts of cruelty by a man whose twisted vision of creating the perfect family would lead to one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history. Gary Michael Heidnick was not the kind of monster who lurked in shadows or preyed on strangers in dark alleys. He was a seemingly successful businessman, a self-proclaimed minister, and a man who had accumulated considerable wealth through shrewd investments. But beneath his veneer of respectability lay a deeply disturbed individual whose descent into madness would culminate in crimes so horrific that they would inspire fictional depictions of evil for decades to come. The story of Gary Heidnick is not just the account of a serial killer, but a chilling examination of how mental illness, unchecked power, and complete moral corruption can transform a human being into something far worse than any fictional monster. Gary Michael Heidnick was born on November 22, 1943, in Cleveland, Ohio, into a family that was dysfunctional from the very beginning. His father, Michael Heidnick, was an abusive alcoholic who ruled the household through intimidation and violence. His mother, Ellen, was emotionally unstable and unable to protect her children from their father's rage. The Heidnick household was a place where love was absent and cruelty was commonplace. Michael Heidnick would beat his children for the smallest infractions, often forcing them to remain silent during the attacks or face even worse punishment. Ellen Heidnick, overwhelmed by her husband's abuse and her own mental health issues, provided no refuge for her sons. Gary's early childhood was marked by a series of traumatic events that would shape his understanding of relationships and power. When he was just 2 years old, he fell from a tree and suffered a head injury that left him with a permanent dent in his skull. Whether this injury contributed to his later psychological problems remains a matter of debate among experts, but it certainly marked the beginning of a pattern of unusual behavior. As Gary grew older, his father's abuse became more targeted and sadistic. Michael Heidnick seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating Gary, often forcing him to hang from pull-up bars until his arms gave out, then beating him when he could no longer hold on. These sessions could last for hours, with Gary's father seeming to derive genuine satisfaction from his son's suffering. The psychological damage from this abuse was compounded by Gary's mother's eventual abandonment of the family. When Gary was 14, Ellen Heidnick could no longer cope with her circumstances and attempted suicide by drinking mercury. She survived but was institutionalized, leaving Gary and his brother Terry alone with their abusive father. Gary's response to these traumatic experiences was to withdraw into himself, developing a rich fantasy life where he had complete control over others. He became fascinated with military hierarchy and discipline, dreaming of scenarios where he commanded absolute obedience from subordinates. These fantasies would later evolve into the twisted vision that would drive his crimes. Gary's teenage years were marked by increasing instability and troubling behavior that foreshadowed the horrors to come. He struggled academically despite being intelligent, often getting into conflicts with teachers and classmates who found his behavior odd and sometimes threatening. At the age of 14, Gary attempted suicide for the first time, swallowing a bottle of pills in what appeared to be a cry for help. Instead of receiving the psychological treatment he desperately needed, he was simply returned to his father's care with no follow-up intervention. This pattern of mental health crises, followed by inadequate treatment, would repeat throughout his life. Gary's relationship with his younger brother Terry became increasingly strained during this period. Terry was everything Gary was not: popular, athletic, and seemingly well-adjusted, despite their shared traumatic childhood. Gary's jealousy of his brother manifested in increasingly cruel behavior, including incidents where he would torture small animals while forcing Terry to watch. When Gary turned 18, he enlisted in the Army, seeking the structure and hierarchy that had been absent from his chaotic home life. Initially, military service seemed to provide him with some stability. He was intelligent and capable when he chose to apply himself, and his superiors noted his potential for leadership. However, Gary's mental health issues soon became apparent even in the structured environment of the military. He began experiencing episodes of depression and paranoia, often claiming that other soldiers were plotting against him. His behavior became increasingly erratic, and he was eventually diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder. After serving for less than 2 years, Gary received a medical discharge from the Army due to his psychological problems. He was awarded a disability pension that would provide him with a steady income for the rest of his life, income that would later enable him to purchase the house where he would commit his crimes. Following his discharge from the Army, Gary returned to Philadelphia, where he began developing the religious delusions that would later justify his criminal behavior. He claimed to have received divine revelations instructing him to create a perfect family through any means necessary. Gary established his own church, which he called the United Church of the Ministers of God. Despite having no formal theological training, he proclaimed himself a bishop and began preaching a twisted version of Christianity that emphasized his own divine authority and the need for absolute obedience to God's chosen representatives, namely himself. The church existed primarily on paper and in Gary's imagination, but it served an important psychological function for him. It provided a framework through which he could justify his desire for complete control over others, casting his future crimes as religious obligations rather than expressions of sadism. During this period, Gary also began his first serious attempts at accumulating wealth. He had inherited some money from relatives and used it to make investments in the stock market. Surprisingly, he proved to be quite skilled at this, turning his initial modest inheritance into a substantial fortune through careful investment in mutual funds and other financial instruments. Gary's growing wealth allowed him to purchase the row house on North Marshall Street that would later become infamous as his House of Horrors. To neighbors, he appeared to be a successful businessman who kept to himself. They had no idea that he was using his money to fund increasingly elaborate fantasies of power and control. Gary's first serious crimes began in the early 1980s, though they initially took forms that were less dramatic than his later offenses. He began frequenting areas of Philadelphia where vulnerable women, particularly those involved in prostitution or struggling with addiction, could be found and exploited. His method was to offer these women money, shelter, or drugs in exchange for their companionship. Once he had established a relationship with them, he would gradually increase his control, using a combination of financial dependence, emotional manipulation, and threats of violence to keep them compliant. Gary's first known victim was Josefina Rivera, a young Puerto Rican woman who was struggling with drug addiction and working as a prostitute to support her habit. Gary encountered her in November 1986 and offered her money and a place to stay in exchange for sexual services. Initially, Rivera was grateful for Gary's apparent generosity. He provided her with food, shelter, and money for drugs, asking only that she remain available to him whenever he desired. The arrangement seemed mutually beneficial, and Rivera had no reason to suspect that she had entered into a relationship with a dangerous predator. However, Gary's true nature soon became apparent. He began making increasingly unreasonable demands on Rivera's time and freedom, insisting that she obtain his permission before leaving the house and becoming violently angry when she interacted with other people. When Rivera attempted to leave, Gary physically prevented her from doing so, making it clear that she was no longer a guest in his house but a prisoner. The transition from voluntary companion to captive victim was gradual but inexorable. Gary chained Rivera in the basement of his house, explaining that this was necessary to prevent her from leaving and disrupting God's plan for their relationship. He told her that she was to be the mother of his children and that her role was to submit completely to his will. Gary's basement became a carefully constructed prison designed to hold multiple victims while allowing him to maintain complete control over their lives. He installed chains and shackles to restrain his captives, soundproofed the walls to prevent their screams from being heard by neighbors, and created a system of punishments and rewards to ensure compliance with his demands. The basement was divided into several areas, each serving a specific function in Gary's twisted scheme. There was a main holding area where victims were chained to the walls, a smaller isolation chamber for those who disobeyed his orders, and a makeshift medical area where Gary performed crude surgical procedures on his captives. Rivera was soon joined by other victims whom Gary had lured to his house through similar methods. Sandra Lindsay was a mentally disabled woman whom Gary had met at a social services facility. She was particularly vulnerable due to her cognitive limitations and had no family members who might report her missing. Deborah Dudley was another young woman struggling with addiction whom Gary encountered on the streets of Philadelphia. Like Rivera, she was initially grateful for Gary's apparent offer of help, not realizing that she was walking into a carefully laid trap. Lisa Thomas was a teenage runaway who had been living on the streets when Gary found her. She was desperate for shelter and protection, making her an ideal target for Gary's predatory behavior. Each new victim followed the same pattern: initial cooperation based on Gary's false promises, followed by gradual realization that they had become prisoners, then complete subjugation to Gary's will through a combination of physical restraint, psychological manipulation, and brutal punishment for any acts of defiance. Once Gary had assembled his collection of victims, he began implementing his twisted vision of creating the perfect family. He informed the women that they were to bear his children and that their role was to submit completely to his authority as the head of the household. The daily routine in Gary's basement prison was designed to break down the victims' resistance and transform them into compliant servants. They were kept chained for most of the day, fed minimal amounts of food, and subjected to regular sexual assault. Gary used a system of arbitrary punishments to keep them in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. The punishments Gary devised were particularly cruel and seemed designed more to satisfy his sadistic impulses than to maintain discipline. Victims who disobeyed his orders or failed to show proper respect were subjected to electric shocks, beaten with various implements, or forced to endure other forms of physical torture. Gary also employed psychological torture, constantly reminding his victims that they were completely at his mercy and that no one was looking for them. He told them that they had been forgotten by the outside world and that their only hope of survival lay in pleasing him and accepting their roles in his twisted family. Perhaps most horrifically, Gary forced his victims to participate in their own degradation and the abuse of their fellow captives. He would order one woman to deliver punishment to another, creating an atmosphere of mutual distrust and complicity that made resistance or escape planning nearly impossible. The basement became a world unto itself, with Gary as its absolute ruler and the chained women as his subjects. He controlled every aspect of their existence, from when they ate and slept to when they were allowed to use the bathroom. This complete control seemed to provide Gary with the sense of power and purpose that had been missing from his life. As months passed, Gary's treatment of his victims became increasingly brutal and sadistic. What had begun as a twisted attempt to create a family evolved into pure torture, with Gary seeming to derive genuine pleasure from the suffering he inflicted. The violence escalated dramatically when Sandra Lindsay became pregnant as a result of Gary's repeated sexual assaults. Rather than viewing this as progress toward his stated goal of creating a family, Gary became enraged when Lindsay suffered a miscarriage. He blamed her for failing to properly care for his child and decided that she needed to be punished severely. Gary's punishment of Lindsay was so brutal that it resulted in her death. He chained her to a pipe in the basement ceiling and left her suspended there for days, occasionally returning to beat her or subject her to electric shocks. Lindsay's pleas for mercy only seemed to increase Gary's fury, and he continued the torture until she died from a combination of physical trauma and medical neglect. Rather than being sobered by Lindsay's death, Gary seemed to be energized by it. He dismembered her body using power tools, then cooked and ate parts of it while forcing the surviving victims to watch. He also ground up portions of Lindsay's remains and mixed them into the food he fed to the other women, telling them they needed to consume their fellow prisoner to gain strength. The consumption of human flesh represented a new level of depravity in Gary's crimes, one that seemed to push him beyond the boundaries of mere sadism into something approaching ritualistic evil. The surviving victims were traumatized not only by witnessing Lindsay's murder, but by being forced to participate in the desecration of her remains. Following Lindsay's death, Gary became increasingly paranoid and unstable. He began to suspect that his remaining victims were plotting against him and implemented even more severe security measures to prevent any possibility of escape or resistance. Gary's paranoia was not entirely unfounded. The surviving women, Rivera, Dudley, and Thomas, had indeed begun to discuss the possibility of escape, though their options were severely limited by their physical restraints and Gary's constant surveillance. The situation in the basement became even more desperate when Gary abducted another victim, 18-year-old Jacqueline Askins. Askins was different from the previous victims in that she came from a stable family background and had people who would actively search for her when she disappeared. Gary's treatment of Askins was particularly brutal, perhaps reflecting his awareness that her disappearance would eventually attract attention from law enforcement. He seemed determined to break her spirit quickly and completely, subjecting her to torture that was extreme even by his twisted standards. The presence of Askins in the basement created additional tensions among the victims. The older prisoners had developed survival strategies based on months of experience with Gary's behavior, while Askins' natural resistance to his demands threatened to bring punishment down on all of them. It was during this period that Deborah Dudley made a fatal mistake. Frustrated by the deteriorating conditions in the basement and the increasing brutality of Gary's behavior, she began to openly defy his orders and encourage the other women to resist his control. Gary's response to Dudley's defiance was swift and deadly. He decided to make an example of her that would terrorize the other victims into complete submission. Using electrical equipment, he electrocuted Dudley while the other women watched, then disposed of her body in the same manner he had used for Lindsay. The murders of Lindsay and Dudley marked a turning point in Gary's criminal enterprise. What had begun as a twisted attempt to create a family had evolved into simple serial killing, with Gary seeming to derive more satisfaction from murder than from the sexual domination that had initially motivated his crimes. The surviving victims, Rivera, Thomas, and Askins, realized that their situation had become hopeless. It was clear that Gary had no intention of ever releasing them and that their chances of survival decreased with each passing day. They began to plan desperately for escape, knowing that their only alternatives were death or continued torture. The opportunity for escape came when Gary made a rare tactical error. Confident in his complete control over his prisoners, he occasionally released one of them from her chains to perform household tasks or assist with his business affairs. He had done this several times with Rivera, whom he considered to be the most compliant and trustworthy of his captives. On March 24, 1987, Gary allowed Rivera to accompany him on a trip to visit his former wife and children in New Jersey. This was an unprecedented level of freedom for any of his victims, and Rivera recognized it as possibly her only chance to escape or seek help. During the trip, Rivera managed to slip away from Gary's supervision long enough to contact her family and inform them of her situation. She provided them with Gary's address and a description of the conditions in his basement, begging them to contact the police immediately. Rivera's family initially had difficulty convincing law enforcement to take her story seriously. The tale of women being held captive in a basement and subjected to torture sounded like the plot of a horror movie rather than a credible report of criminal activity. However, Rivera's detailed knowledge of Gary's house and her obvious emotional trauma eventually convinced investigators that her story needed to be taken seriously. On March 25, 1987, Philadelphia police obtained a search warrant for Gary's house on North Marshall Street. When they arrived to execute the warrant, Gary initially denied any knowledge of the crimes Rivera had described, claiming that she was a former girlfriend who was seeking revenge for their failed relationship. However, when officers began searching the house, they quickly discovered evidence that confirmed Rivera's account. The basement had been converted into a prison, complete with chains, shackles, and the torture devices Gary had used on his victims. More horrifically, they found the remains of Sandra Lindsay and Deborah Dudley, along with evidence of Gary's cannibalistic activities. Most importantly, they found Lisa Thomas and Jacqueline Askins still chained in the basement, barely alive after months of torture and abuse. Both women were severely malnourished, bearing extensive injuries from Gary's torture sessions, and suffering from severe psychological trauma that would require years of treatment to address. The discovery of Gary's crimes sent shockwaves through Philadelphia and the nation. The sheer brutality of what had occurred in the basement of an ordinary-looking row house challenged people's assumptions about the nature of evil and the safety of urban neighborhoods. Gary was arrested without resistance, apparently relieved that his crimes had finally been discovered. During his initial interrogation, he showed no remorse for his actions and seemed puzzled by investigators' horror at what he had done. He claimed that his actions had been justified by divine revelation and that he had been carrying out God's will. Gary's trial began in 1988 and immediately became a media sensation. The horrific nature of his crimes, combined with his bizarre religious justifications for his behavior, created a spectacle that attracted national attention and raised disturbing questions about the nature of evil and mental illness. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Gary's guilt, including testimony from the surviving victims, forensic evidence from the crime scene, and Gary's own admissions to investigators. The case was straightforward from a legal standpoint. There was no question that Gary had committed the crimes with which he was charged. The defense attempted to argue that Gary was not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that his religious delusions and history of mental illness had rendered him incapable of understanding the nature and consequences of his actions. They presented expert testimony about his psychological condition and his history of abuse and trauma. However, the prosecution successfully argued that Gary's crimes showed clear evidence of planning, premeditation, and rational decision-making that was inconsistent with legal insanity. They pointed out that Gary had taken elaborate precautions to avoid detection, had maintained normal relationships with neighbors and business associates, and had demonstrated the ability to distinguish between right and wrong in other areas of his life. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Lindsay and Dudley. Gary was sentenced to death, making him one of the most notorious inmates on Pennsylvania's death row. In the years following Gary's conviction, mental health professionals have studied his case extensively, seeking to understand the psychological factors that contributed to his transformation into a serial killer and torturer. Their analyses have revealed a complex interplay of childhood trauma, mental illness, and personality disorders that created the perfect conditions for the development of extreme criminal behavior. Gary's childhood abuse undoubtedly played a significant role in shaping his later behavior. The physical and emotional trauma he experienced at the hands of his father taught him that relationships were based on power and domination rather than love and mutual respect. I realized these patterns in his treatment of his victims. His mother's abandonment and eventual suicide also contributed to his deeply disturbed view of relationships, particularly with women. Gary seemed to view women as inherently untrustworthy and likely to abandon him, which may have motivated his desire to physically restrain his victims and prevent them from leaving. The head injury Gary suffered as a child has also been cited as a potential contributing factor to his criminal behavior. While brain injuries do not directly cause criminal behavior, they can sometimes result in impulse control problems and difficulty regulating emotions that may increase the risk of violence. However, experts have noted that millions of people experience childhood trauma, mental illness, and even brain injuries without becoming serial killers. What made Gary different was the combination of these risk factors with a personality structure that was fundamentally lacking in empathy and moral development. Dr. Philip Resnick, a forensic psychiatrist who examined Gary, noted that he displayed characteristics consistent with both antisocial personality disorder and schizotypal personality disorder. This combination created an individual who was both capable of meticulous planning and completely indifferent to the suffering of others. The surviving victims of Gary's crimes faced a long and difficult recovery process that extended far beyond their physical injuries. The psychological trauma they had endured during their captivity created lasting effects that required years of intensive therapy and support. Josefina Rivera, who had been Gary's prisoner the longest, suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder that manifested in nightmares, flashbacks, and an inability to form trusting relationships with others. She required extensive counseling and medication to manage her symptoms and has never fully recovered from her ordeal. Lisa Thomas and Jacqueline Askins face similar challenges, though their shorter periods of captivity may have slightly reduced the severity of their trauma. Both women struggled with depression, anxiety, and trust issues that affected every aspect of their lives for years after their rescue. The survivors also faced the additional trauma of having to testify about their experiences during Gary's trial, forcing them to relive their ordeal in a public forum while being cross-examined by defense attorneys seeking to minimize Gary's culpability. Despite these challenges, all three survivors eventually managed to rebuild their lives to some degree. They have become advocates for victims' rights and have worked to raise awareness about the long-term effects of severe trauma. Their courage in surviving Gary's torture and then facing the challenge of recovery has been an inspiration to other crime victims and trauma survivors. Gary's crimes had a significant impact on popular culture and public awareness of serial killers and torture. The case was one of the first to receive extensive media coverage that detailed the psychological aspects of serial killing and the methods used by predators to control their victims. The case also influenced the development of criminal profiling techniques and investigative methods used by law enforcement agencies when dealing with similar crimes. Gary's methods of victim selection, psychological manipulation, and physical control became textbook examples of predatory behavior studied by criminal justice professionals. Perhaps most significantly, Gary's crimes inspired several fictional works, most notably the character of Buffalo Bill in Thomas Harris's novel, The Silence of the Lambs. While Buffalo Bill's specific crimes were different from Gary's, the character's methods of imprisoning women in a basement dungeon were clearly inspired by the Philadelphia House of Horrors. This fictional adaptation helped to cement Gary's place in the pantheon of infamous American serial killers, ensuring that his crimes would be remembered and studied long after his death. However, this cultural impact also raised ethical questions about the exploitation of real victims suffering for entertainment purposes. Gary Heidnik was executed by lethal injection on July 6, 1999, at the State Correctional Institution at Rockview in Pennsylvania. He was 55 years old and had spent over 11 years on death row, during which time he showed no remorse for his crimes and continued to insist that his actions had been justified by divine command. In his final statement, Gary offered no apology to his victims or their families. Instead, he used his last moments to proclaim his innocence and to claim that he was being executed for following God's will. This final display of narcissism and lack of empathy confirmed that Gary had remained fundamentally unchanged by his years in prison. Gary's execution marked the end of one of the most disturbing criminal careers in American history. His crimes had shocked the nation and forced uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and the adequacy of systems designed to identify and treat dangerous individuals before they commit serious crimes. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of society's most marginalized members, people struggling with addiction, mental illness, or homelessness, who are often targeted by predators precisely because their disappearances are less likely to be noticed or thoroughly investigated. The case of Gary Heidnik offers several important lessons for society, law enforcement, and mental health professionals. Perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates the critical importance of early intervention with severely disturbed individuals who show signs of dangerous behavior. Gary's history of mental illness, violent fantasies, and escalating criminal behavior should have served as warning signs that he posed a significant threat to public safety. However, the mental health and criminal justice systems of his era were ill-equipped to identify and effectively treat individuals with his combination of disorders. The case also highlights the need for better protection and support services for vulnerable populations who are most likely to be targeted by predators. Many of Gary's victims were women who were struggling with addiction, mental illness, or other problems that made them easy targets for exploitation. Finally, Gary's crimes demonstrate the importance of taking reports of missing persons seriously, particularly when the missing individuals come from marginalized communities. Several of Gary's victims had been reported missing by family members, but these reports were not given the priority they deserved by law enforcement agencies. The story of Gary Heidnik is ultimately a story about the capacity for evil that exists within human nature and the terrible price paid by innocent people when that evil is allowed to flourish unchecked. His crimes represent a level of cruelty and sadism that challenges our understanding of human behavior and forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the potential for darkness within our society. Gary's victims, Sandra Lindsay, Deborah Dudley, and the women who survived his torture, paid the ultimate price for society's failure to recognize and stop a dangerous predator before he could act on his twisted fantasies. Their suffering serves as a permanent reminder of the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would exploit and harm the vulnerable. The basement at 3520 North Marshall Street has been sealed and the house demolished, erasing the physical evidence of Gary's crimes. But the memory of what occurred there continues to serve as a warning about the monsters that can hide behind facades of respectability and the terrible consequences when evil is allowed to operate in darkness. Gary Heidnik is gone, but the lessons of his crimes remain relevant as society continues to grapple with issues of mental illness, violence, and the protection of vulnerable populations. His story reminds us that the price of safety is eternal vigilance, and that we must never become complacent about the potential for evil that exists within our communities. The House of Horrors has been destroyed, but the horror itself lives on in the memories of survivors and in the cautionary tale that serves as Gary Heidnik's only positive legacy. A reminder of what happens when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members from those who would prey upon them. Story 3, The Grim Sleeper. The summer heat of 1985 pressed down on South Los Angeles like a suffocating blanket. In the maze of streets that made up this corner of the city, where palm trees cast long shadows over modest homes and corner stores, something sinister was stirring. It would be decades before anyone realized that a predator had begun his hunt, moving through the neighborhood with the patience of someone who believed he would never be caught. Deborah Jackson was 29 years old when she disappeared on August 12, 1985. A mother, a daughter, a woman with dreams and fears like anyone else. She had been walking along Western Avenue in the early morning hours when she vanished into the darkness. 3 weeks later, her body was discovered in an alley near the Vermont Slauson area, a .25 caliber bullet wound to the chest, telling the grim story of her final moments. The detectives who worked the case that summer couldn't have known they were looking at the first confirmed victim of what would become one of Los Angeles's most haunting serial killer cases. Deborah's death was filed away with hundreds of others, another tragedy in a city that seemed to collect them like rainwater in storm drains. 2 months later, in October, Henrietta Wright met the same fate. The 35-year-old woman was found shot to death, the same caliber weapon, the same cold precision. Then came Thomas Steele in December, Barbara Ware in January of 1986, and Bernita Sparks that April. Each victim discovered in the same general area of South Los Angeles, each killed with the same methodical violence. But what made this case extraordinary wasn't just the killing, it was the silence that followed. For 14 years, the murders stopped, completely, as if the killer had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions and grieving families. The case files gathered dust, detectives retired. The neighborhood moved on, though the families of the victims never could. Then in 2002, the killing began again. Princess Bertomeu was found shot to death in July. Valerie McCorvey followed in July 2003. The same weapon, the same area, the same chilling precision. It was as if someone had awakened from a long sleep and decided to continue exactly where they had left off. This pattern of dormancy, followed by renewed activity, would later give the killer his nickname, the Grim Sleeper. Detective Dennis Kilcoyne had worked hundreds of homicide cases during his career with the LAPD, but this one was different. The ballistics evidence was undeniable. The same .25 caliber pistol had been used in multiple murders, spanning nearly 2 decades. But who could remain undetected for so long? Who could kill with such consistency, then disappear for over a decade, only to return as if nothing had changed? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a criminal database in a stroke of investigative fortune that would have seemed like science fiction just a few decades earlier. In 2008, investigators decided to run familial DNA testing on evidence collected from the crime scenes. This cutting-edge technique didn't look for exact matches, but rather for genetic relatives who might lead them to their suspect. The DNA profile from the crime scenes was compared against California's database of convicted felons and arrestees. The computer found a partial match. Christopher Franklin, a young man who had been arrested on weapons charges. The DNA wasn't a perfect match, but it was close enough to suggest a family connection. Very close. Investigators began to build a family tree around Christopher Franklin, looking for male relatives who would have been adults during the time of the murders. The trail led them to Christopher's father, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. Born in 1952, Lonnie Franklin had lived in South Los Angeles his entire life. He worked as a mechanic and sanitation worker, jobs that kept him moving through the very neighborhoods where the murders had occurred. He was married, had children, and by all outward appearances lived the life of an ordinary working man. His neighbors knew him as someone who kept to himself, who worked on cars in his driveway and minded his own business. But the DNA evidence suggested otherwise. The challenge now was confirming the match without alerting Franklin that he was under investigation. In one of the most elaborate undercover operations in LAPD history, detectives began following Franklin, waiting for the perfect opportunity to collect a sample of his DNA. That opportunity came at a pizza restaurant. Detectives watched as Franklin ordered food, ate at a table, and then left, leaving behind plates, cups, and utensils. The moment he walked out the door, investigators moved in, carefully collecting every item he had touched. The DNA extracted from these items would provide the final piece of the puzzle. The match was perfect. On July 7, 2010, 25 years after Deborah Jackson's murder, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was arrested at his home on 81st Street in South Los Angeles. The house was less than 2 miles from where several of his victims had been found. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster described by police. Franklin had attended neighborhood barbecues, had worked alongside other men for decades, had seemed so utterly ordinary that his double life was almost impossible to believe. But as investigators searched his home, a disturbing picture began to emerge. They found photographs, hundreds of them, of women in various states of undress and consciousness. Some appeared to be sleeping or unconscious. Others looked directly at the camera with expressions that were difficult to interpret. Many of the women were unidentified, leading investigators to wonder if Franklin's crimes extended far beyond the murders for which they could prove his guilt. Among the photographs were images of some of the known victims, apparently taken while they were still alive. The implications were chilling. Franklin hadn't simply been a killer, but someone who had documented his interactions with victims, creating a gallery of his crimes. The trial of Lonnie David Franklin Jr. began in 2016, more than 30 years after his first known murder. Prosecutors painted a picture of a methodical killer who had used his knowledge of South Los Angeles to hunt victims in areas where he knew he was unlikely to be noticed or caught. His victims, they argued, were often women involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, people who might not be immediately missed, whose disappearances might not trigger intensive investigations. Franklin's defense team faced an almost impossible task. The DNA evidence was overwhelming, linking him conclusively to multiple crime scenes. The ballistics evidence showed that the same weapon had been used across decades. The photographic evidence suggested a pattern of behavior that went far beyond the murders for which he was charged. Perhaps most disturbing was the question of the 14-year gap. What had happened between 1988 and 2002? Had Franklin really stopped killing, or had he simply become better at hiding his crimes? Had he moved to other locations? Had he changed his methods? Some investigators theorized that Franklin's hiatus might have coincided with a period of incarceration for other crimes, though no definitive explanation was ever established. Others suggested that he might have been focusing on crimes that didn't result in death, assault, kidnapping, or other violent offenses that wouldn't have connected him to the murder investigation. The trial revealed the painstaking detective work that had finally brought Franklin to justice. Investigators had spent years mapping out the timeline of the murders, analyzing ballistics evidence, interviewing witnesses, and following up on hundreds of leads. The case had consumed the careers of multiple detectives, some of whom had retired before seeing their work reach its conclusion. On May 5, 2016, after deliberating for just a few hours, the jury found Lonnie David Franklin Jr. guilty on all counts, 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The speed of their deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him. During the penalty phase of the trial, prosecutors argued that Franklin deserved the death penalty for the calculated nature of his crimes and the terror he had inflicted on South Los Angeles for decades. Defense attorneys pleaded for life in prison, arguing that execution would serve no purpose beyond revenge. The jury recommended death, and Judge Kathleen Kennedy sentenced Franklin accordingly. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison to await execution, joining California's death row population of more than 700 inmates. But Franklin's story would not end with his conviction. In March 2020, while still appealing his conviction and death sentence, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was found dead in his cell at San Quentin. He was 67 years old. The official cause of death was listed as a combination of heart disease and other chronic conditions, though the timing meant that many questions about his crimes would never be answered. His death closed one chapter of the Grim Sleeper case, but opened another. With Franklin unable to provide any confession or explanation for his crimes, investigators were left to piece together the full scope of his criminal activity from the evidence alone. The photographs found in his home remained a particular source of concern. Police released images of some of the unidentified women, hoping that family members or friends might recognize them and come forward. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of families contacted police, believing they recognized loved ones who had disappeared over the years. Some of these cases led to new investigations, though connecting Franklin to additional murders proved challenging without the DNA or ballistics evidence that had been so crucial in the original prosecutions. The passage of time had made witness testimony unreliable, and many potential crime scenes had been lost to urban development or simply forgotten. The Grim Sleeper case highlighted several troubling aspects of serial crime investigation. Franklin had been able to operate for decades partly because his victims came from a marginalized community where missing persons reports might not receive the same attention as they would in other neighborhoods. The 14-year gap in his known killings suggested that serial killers might be far more patient and methodical than popular culture typically portrays. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrated both the power and the limitations of modern forensic science. DNA testing had ultimately solved murders that had remained cold for decades, but it had taken years for the technology to develop to the point where familial searching became possible. How many other cold cases might be solved using similar techniques? The investigation also raised questions about how many serial killers might be operating undetected in major cities. Franklin had managed to avoid capture for 25 years while living openly in the community where his crimes were committed. He had worked regular jobs, maintained relationships, and presented the facade of a normal life while systematically hunting and killing women. For the families of Franklin's victims, his conviction brought a measure of closure, but also new questions. Deborah Jackson's family had waited 25 years to learn who had killed their loved one and why. By the time Franklin was convicted, some family members had died without ever knowing the truth about what had happened. The Grim Sleeper case became a textbook example of the evolution of criminal investigation techniques. It showed how DNA technology, when combined with traditional detective work, could solve crimes that had seemed hopeless. It also demonstrated the importance of maintaining evidence over long periods, as samples collected in the 1980s proved crucial to securing convictions decades later. The case continues to influence how law enforcement approaches serial crime investigation. The long dormancy period in Franklin's killing spree has led investigators to reconsider assumptions about serial killer behavior and to maintain active investigations even when cases appear to have gone cold. Today, the streets of South Los Angeles, where Franklin once hunted, have changed, but the memory of his crimes remains. The case serves as a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, that justice sometimes requires decades of patient work, and that the victims of violent crime deserve to be remembered not just as statistics, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by inexplicable cruelty. The Grim Sleeper's reign of terror may have ended with his conviction and death, but the questions his case raised about serial crime, community safety, and the long arc of justice continue to resonate. In a city of millions where thousands of crimes occur every year, The case of Lonnie David Franklin Jr. stands as both a victory for persistence in law enforcement and a sobering reminder of how long evil can remain hidden among us. So close your eyes. Let the hush of the night wrap around you. And know this, some stories don't end. They drift. They dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.